You think you know how an empire falls? You picture riots, fiery speeches, a tyrant and a people desperate for freedom. But the truth about France in the 1780s is far more brutal. The most powerful empire in Europe didn't collapse because of philosophy. And it didn't collapse because the people finally realized they were oppressed. It collapsed because of a ledger and a falsified financial report. I'm Dave. Today, we're not talking about 1789, the year of the guillotine. We're going back a full decade to watch how a system that seemed unbreakable dug its own grave. Not with swords, but with debts that could never be paid and meals that kept getting harder to afford. Look at France in 1783. On the surface, everything was perfect. They had just helped America win independence from the British. Versailles was the cultural center of the known world. But the system running it all was rotting from the inside. France was divided into three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else, who made up 97% of the population. The top two estates owned most of the country's wealth, and they paid almost no taxes. Every bill, the palace, the army, the national debt, landed on the 97%. But here's the part most textbooks skip. This wasn't new. The French had lived under this system for centuries. Their grandparents had. Their great-grandparents had. Injustice didn't start revolutions. It was the baseline. So what changed? The king ran out of cash. Funding the American Revolution sounded glorious, but ruinously expensive. It had left France 1.3 billion livres in debt. To keep borrowing from European creditors, the finance minister Jacques Necker published a public report in 1781 claiming France was running a surplus. He cooked the numbers. He fooled the creditors, but he also fooled France itself. When you build a national economy on a lie, you don't need an army to bring it down. All you need is one bad harvest. By 1786, the lie couldn't hold. The treasury was empty. The government was genuinely bankrupt. Louis XVI now faced simple math. He couldn't squeeze the Third Estate any harder. They had nothing left to give. The only way to save the kingdom from default was to tax the nobility and the church. So he summoned the nobles, asked them to share the burden. The nobility said no. They protected their privileges to the end. And in a desperate move, the king was forced to call the Estates General in 1789, a representative assembly that hadn't met in 175 years. He didn't call them to give people democracy. He needed a legal excuse to raise new taxes. He needed an ATM. But the king had picked the single worst moment in history to ask his people for money. Because in the summer of 1788, the sky over France turned violet. July 13, 1788, a freak hailstorm tore through France's most important farming regions. Wheat fields that were weeks from harvest were flattened in a single afternoon. In some areas, crop losses hit nearly 100%. Then nature landed another blow, the worst winter in 80 years. The Loire River, a lifeline for moving grain to the cities, froze solid. Even the little food left in storage couldn't be shipped. Water wheels stopped turning. Wheat couldn't be ground into flour. France's food supply chain snapped clean. In normal years, the crown would flood the market with imported grain to keep prices stable. But the treasury was empty. The government stood by helpless as a starving market set its own price on human survival. Normally, a 4-pound loaf of bread, a working man's daily ration, would cost around 8 sous. By early 1789, it had jumped to 14, then 15 sous. A laborer in Paris earned 15 to 20 sous a day. Bread was now eating up 80% of everything he made. The math of survival had broken down. And that's when it hit the streets of Paris. Picture the city in that moment. In the Faubourg Saint-Germain, the streets were wide and swept clean. Gilded carriages moved without interruption. Behind ornate iron gates sat enormous limestone mansions with immaculate private gardens and oversized glass windows. A luxury of the era put there to advertise wealth. At the Palais Royal complex, the elite sipped coffee under oil lamps, debated the arts, and enjoyed functioning underground drains. For the people who lived here, the doubling of bread prices meant their morning brioche cost a few more sous. An inconvenience. The wall of wealth kept reality completely out. A mile away, in the craftsmen's district of Faubourg Saint-Antoine, or the alleys around the market of Les Halles, was a different planet. No boulevards, no paving stones, just narrow, twisting lanes where two handcarts could barely pass. The ground was a mire of mud and refuse. Open sewage channels ran down the middle of the street. Household waste and slaughterhouse blood draining straight into the Seine. 3 to 4 story tenements of rotting timber and crumbling plaster, each floor jutting out further than the one below, until the eaves nearly touched across the gap, blocking daylight forever. No glass in the windows. Residents stuffed them with oil paper or rags to keep out the winter cold. Inside, 3 or 4 generations sleeping on rotting straw. Clean water wasn't on tap. It was bought bucket by bucket from street vendors. This was the world of the 97%. The people who built everything in France, who owned nothing. For them, bread at 15 sous wasn't an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. The delegates of the Third Estate didn't arrive at Versailles with philosophical ideals. They arrived with the fury of people who had watched their neighbors starve. Here's the thing most history classes get wrong about the French Revolution. We learn about Voltaire, Rousseau, the Enlightenment, the great ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity that awakened the people and drove them to overthrow a king. But look at the dates. Voltaire died in 1778. Rousseau died that same year. The men who wrote the intellectual foundation for the revolution had been in the ground for a full decade before the Bastille fell. The blacksmiths, the fishwives, the women who stormed Versailles. They didn't wake up at 4 in the morning to read treatises on the social contract. They woke up to count whether they could afford half a loaf of bread. Enlightenment philosophy didn't create the revolution. Bankruptcy did. What the philosophers and lawyers gave people was a vocabulary, words to name what was already happening. When people were starving and furious, the intellectuals stepped in and said, "Your anger isn't just hunger. It's a human right. Your uprising isn't a riot. It's justice. Ideas don't shatter systems. Empty stomachs do." Ideas only arrive afterward to make sense of the rubble. If France hadn't funded the American War, if Jacques Necker hadn't lied, if 1788 had been a good harvest, would the revolution have happened in 1789? Almost certainly not. But history has no what-ifs. The structure had been stretched to its limit, and nature had just delivered the final blow. Every complex society, whether an 18th century monarchy or a 21st century democracy, runs on an unspoken deal. Those at the bottom will carry the heaviest loads, absorb the injustice, and hold their peace as long as the system still lets them survive. France's elite forgot that. They built magnificent palaces on a foundation that was already cracking. They believed their power came from bloodlines, from armies, from centuries of peasant submission. They never understood that their real power was measured in the price of a loaf of bread. When that line broke, a 1,000-year system collapsed in a matter of months. Now you know how an empire falls, not with manifestos. It starts in the ledgers of Versailles. It ends at empty bread stalls in Paris. But history carries one brutal law. Tearing down an old system is always easier than building a new one. The people had toppled a king because they wanted bread. However, the power structure taking shape after 1789 was about to show them that the price of liberty is sometimes paid in blood. But that is a story for another journey. Until next time.